You are called Gay X Trad on YouTube. Can you tell me where that name came from?
Yeah, so I grew up pretty secular, and then as I became a teenager, joined the traditional Catholic movement, which is a very small subsect of mainstream Catholicism, where we preserved all the traditions from the 15th and 16th century. We love tradition, and so it's kind of generally referred to as the traditional movement. And then throughout that entire process and dealing with that crazy movement, I also knew that I was gay, but was in the closet living a celibate life. And so when I went to make YouTube content, I was like, we'll just throw gay and then X trad on the as for the name.
You said you come from a Catholic church. Tell me about that. So how did your journey start in Catholicism?
Yeah, so I grew up in a pretty liberal Catholic household. Dogmatic belief certainly wasn't part of our intellectual repertoire. And religion was essentially a way of self-soothing, of having or knowing our place in the universe. And then as soon as I entered high school, I knew that I was gay. Didn't want anything to do with it. At the same time, I was having trouble making friends, finding my place in the world, and then found a local youth group at the parish that I went to growing up. Immediately made friends, started learning the lingo, and as I was joining that group, believed more and more and gave like everything that I had to Jesus, and then also gave over my life in terms of my sexuality to him. And then within the Catholic Church, a lot of people know maybe a parish down their street, or they see stuff from Pope Francis on the news. That's the group that I started in, but there's a whole movement that is essentially at war with the mainstream Catholic Church, fighting to preserve everything in Latin, all these older liturgies, a much more theologically conservative view of the world. Anything like our grandparents' generation, when they talk about how the Catholic Church used to be, that's the group that I was a part of that wanted to keep the things that way. And so we were radical in terms of belief, in terms of action, in terms of liturgy, and everything that we did, like the outside world really had no clue what we were up to because of how crazy and insulated this group was.
What does liturgy mean?
So liturgy is kind of like Sunday worship, but a lot of Christian churches, they'll have some sort of perhaps sermon in there. They'll have some songs. There might even be a little bit of communion. But liturgy in the Catholic sense, when you think of old textbooks from like the Protestant Reformation, you have these big ornate cathedrals, you have full choirs, you have incense, you have these giant altars, you have so many people, all of these clerics up at the front of the altar. And kind of the big difference between a lot of Christian churches and especially a traditional Catholic church is that Sunday worship isn't just a gathering spot. It's not just a time to experience community and to hear a message. In old Catholic theology, Sunday Mass is a sacrifice. It's a representation of Christ's sacrifice on Calvary. And so people want to give their utmost respect to that. And that's where you have all of these beautiful ornate churches from kind of the medieval period, because people were so intent on seeing liturgy or the Sunday worship as a form of adoration to God versus a community to kind of experience and play some songs with.
And what was it like coming out in that environment?
Yeah, so our particular group, very theologically conservative. You could experience same-sex attraction, but acting on it in any way was absolutely not allowed. We did a lot of campaigning against gay marriage and anything having to do with the LGBT agenda, and saw that as kind of like a scourge on modern civilization. And so when I was in it, I knew that I was gay, but purposely didn't come out to anybody because I knew what we believed, and I knew kind of the sentiments that people had. And so I stayed in the closet. I was leading a lot of various groups within that group, and was seen as kind of like the apologist to go to. And I just didn't ever want to come out as something that I was trying to run away from, even though I knew deep down I never came out in those circles. And then once I eventually came out publicly, then I don't stay in contact with anybody except for maybe one or two people from that movement, because being gay, absolutely not okay. Being same-sex attracted, like, you can do it, but it's kind of like a defect.
So you pretty much got excommunicated from that group when you came out?
Yeah, once I came out publicly, it's none of the relationships that I've had had been the same. And the only people that I still stay in contact to, they know, or they don't agree with my lifestyle. They never show up to my wedding. We were good friends. I kind of stay in contact. But yeah, as soon as I left that group, I am off of their list and somebody that nobody wants to talk to anymore.
So what initially attracted you to that sort of church environment?
Yeah, I mean, so I joined when I went to public schools after going to Catholic elementary schools. I've always been somebody that really only makes friendships based off of similar interests. And so to go into the public school sphere, not knowing anybody, not really being involved in sports or any clubs, I just had a really hard time making friends in public school. And then there's this youth group, and I'm good at learning things. I'm good at regurgitating information. I kind of think logically. And it was a group that, like, once I started experiencing the community, I started knowing kind of the intellectual side and was looked up to. And the thing that I found is, especially for people that are neurodivergent, to have like a sense of grounding in reality, a sense of like, this is true and we're not just blobs floating through the universe. There's something compelling about that. And then also when it comes to sexuality, that like, hey, you don't ever have to come out. You can experience same-sex attraction, and that's not absolutely terrible, but you also don't have to act on it. I was like, oh, perfect. I get to be gay without actually having to be gay. And then in that community, then also the intellectual side, I started leading groups pretty early on. I love the apologetics. They're big on like the arguments for defending the faith. And so kind of having friends a bit based around an interest, and then not having to actually come out publicly as gay. And then as I came into the traditional movement, which is like a subsect of Catholicism, one, you feel the sense of purpose because like you have it figured out. God has chosen to reveal his teachings for you. And so you feel rebellious, and every teenager wants to be rebellious in some way. And so my forum was like, we need to be more like the 1960s or the 1800s or the 1500s. And there's kind of that excitement, that sense of fighting, that sense of cause. And then also you throw that beauty in there where, like I was talking about, Sunday Mass is beautiful, and they're big on the vestments, which are like what do priests wear, these big ornate garments, and the altars and the music. And I remember stepping foot into my first Latin Mass, and it's still one of the most beautiful things that I've ever seen. And it just knocks you off your socks because it's unlike anything out there in the modern world. And so you have this sense of like truth, this sense of goodness, the sense of beauty all together. And yeah, it's a great community if you're okay with swallowing these terrible beliefs.
And you seemed pretty committed to being celibate. Like this meant so much to you that you were willing to deny your sexuality, and commit your life to lifelong celibacy.
Yeah, I think in how the Catholic Church talks about same-sex attraction is that it's part of your experience, but it's not your identity. And that really at the end of the day, we're all longing for God. And so that no, even straight marriage is perfectly going to fulfill our desires, but that we're all built for God and we all find fulfillment in him. And so I was perfectly okay foregoing marriage on this earth because, especially in the Catholic tradition, celibacy, even for straight people, when it comes to the priesthood, when it comes to religious life, is already kind of part of the puzzle and is already a sacrifice that even straight people are willing to make. And so being gay, I was like, yeah, I mean, it wasn't. I remember when I first kind of made that decision to follow Christ in that particular way, I was a little bit sad that I couldn't ever get married, but also like God's the ultimate fulfillment. And so even though it's a sacrifice, like God demands of us sacrifice and he'll give us true peace. And so that was kind of my going motto for a number of years.
When was the moment you sort of realized that it's not worth it, or I don't believe this anymore? I don't need to commit my life to celibacy. Like, yeah, when was the moment? What was the turning point for you?
Yeah, there's kind of like two stops. One is my doubt in the traditional movement overall, which happened. So I grew up in a middle upper class suburb, big on education, and so I had a great community, great suburban environment, and so to be a traditional Catholic and just tear down the modern world and to just criticize, it's so easy when you don't actually see that lived out. And so I went to this traditional Catholic college, and for the first time in my life, I saw people that weren't converts. They were actually raised in this movement. And everything that I taught about how birth control leads to the downfall of civilization, and we need to uphold this traditional sexual ethic, for the first time, I was like, wow, the kids that are raised in this, that are steeped in these beliefs, are really damaged and are very different than the kids I grew up with. And for the first time, I was like, yeah, maybe the modern world doesn't have everything right, but I personally would have rather taken my upbringing in a secular suburban environment than raised in this movement. So kind of like my first stumbling block was this movement does not have all the answers for living perfectly happy lives. And then about a year and a half later, I had moved or dropped out of the college, was running my business, and I started really examining and having to explain to a friend who wasn't Catholic why I believed things. And I realized like I was really only accepting this idea of celibacy on faith. that celibacy is a huge commitment. And to say I'm never going to get married out there, that is a huge commitment. And the level of evidence that I was seeing, like there was some there, but it was kind of like down here. And most of kind of the gap between a little bit of reason to actually making commitment was faith. So it was like, I'm sacrificing the ability to ever love, to ever get married, based off of faith. And that just wasn't a good enough answer for me to sacrifice something that big.
Are you like a Christian? Would you say you're a Christian today?
No, I've entirely left religion.
Okay.
I would say that I still am involved in conversations with a lot of Christians. I still find religion fascinating. I think religion has both a lot of pros and a lot of cons, and I think all those pros and cons can be explained from a secular perspective. And so anytime somebody goes to try to convert me and they're like, insert this benefit of living religion or for being religious in this other person's life, I think most all of those can be explained for secular reasons. And I'm still interested in spirituality, not in a religious sense, but in growing and improving and finding peace. But I've altogether left religion.
What about, because obviously like I'm gay and Christian, but I struggle deeply with the church, and so many people don't seem to get that. I'm very like anti-church culture, anti-religion, but I seem to have discovered Jesus through that. And I see Jesus as a kind of a separate entity, even though we both read the same book. It's so weird, but we've just gotten a different interpretation. But when you were in these environments, was there any did you feel any relationship with the spiritual being of Jesus? Tell me about that.
Yeah, so in Catholicism, we have what is called the Eucharist, which is Sunday communion, which is a lot of how a lot of Christians would understand it. In Catholic circles, people take the idea of Jesus being present in kind of Sunday communion literally, that Jesus is present, body, blood, soul, and divinity, truly and substantially in that piece of bread. And so a lot of focus in Catholic spirituality is prayer with Jesus face to face in an adoration chapel, which is where Sunday communion is kind of displayed in a giant case. And you can go there throughout the week, whether it's 5 a.m. or 5 p.m. or whatever time it is, and to just sit in silence and to just pray and have a relationship with Jesus. And I found having a relationship with Jesus, especially when I was first getting started in Catholicism, a beautiful thing. He's somebody that willed you into creation. He's somebody that's there for you in times of distress. He's somebody that knows what the human experience is like. And so I'd say that I had a great relationship with Jesus and found a lot of benefit in there. But I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of different versions of Jesus out there. And the Jesus that Catholicism, and especially traditional Catholicism, taught, especially as you get more theologically conservative, he just wants you to suffer through all of life so that you can be united to him in the cross. He wants every single element of you, that you can't refuse anything. You can't ever say no. That is love. Though people will say it's unconditional, it's conditional in that you have to follow all of his teaching, and that he will not hesitate to throw you into like a fire if you do something wrong and don't confess it on this side of earth. And as I got deeper into especially traditional Catholicism, Jesus changed a lot. And I think a lot of people have a lot of different experiences of Jesus, of their higher power, of their creator. And I think that's awesome. I say, like, if your God doesn't have a problem with me, I don't have a problem with your God. And I think there's an element that Catholics, or that a lot of Christians will say, like, everybody has some sort of God. And I think everybody has some sort of belief, some sort of idea of where they are in the universe, some sort of like this metaphorical substrate that they belong to. And so I think a lot of people have a lot of different beliefs on that. And I think that's great. My only problem is when people start saying this is the only way to do it and this is how the government should work.
Yeah, I actually feel the same. But I suppose the way you're describing Jesus, I always see that as misinterpretation. But then who's to say that my interpretation is right? But then I suppose I'm always like, is it loving? Is it kind? Is it compassionate? And more about trying to reflect those qualities. Okay, so do you see any sort of hope for Reformation in the Catholic Church to become more accepting of gay people?
I know a few creators here, even just in Denver, who are working from within Catholicism to allow queer people to have a place where they feel that they can be out publicly, that can live awesome lives. And I know a lot of Catholics know this podcast, but something that I'd probably recommend both to you and to your listeners is called the Dear Alana podcast. It's an 8-part series about a girl who was around my age here in Denver who got involved in the movement. was eventually subjected to conversion therapy by a local priest that's still an active priest here in the diocese, and unfortunately ended up passing away because of that trauma, and couldn't. She just felt she couldn't live life as somebody who was out and proud, and so decided to take her own life. And so the creator of that project, who's a good friend of mine, he still considers himself Catholic. He still goes to mass on the weekends. He still loves Jesus. He just thinks that queer people should have a place where they can be accepted, where they can live awesome lives. And I was interviewing him last week and just put out a video on my channel with Justin from Empty Chairs, who's great with dialoguing between conservative and liberal Catholics. And he's in a great relationship and is pushing for, hey, we love the church. We just don't like this particular teaching. It really harms people. And so I think there is kind of this renaissance of people pushing it back against this conservative Catholicism. And I provide my resources and do interviews with people like that. I'm not interested in rejoining the church really at any time in the future. I think and this may be another point, is that sometimes the strongest faiths are also the most brittle. And in traditional Catholicism, where there is only one version of Jesus, there is no sort of self-interpretation, that the church teaches what are called dogmas, which are these beliefs like, we believe that Jesus had two natures, that you can't ever question that, or the Bible says this. Catholics read the Bible, but they don't interpret it for themselves, because the church tells you exactly what to believe in these really long and complicated documents. And so my faith experience was, you got to believe these things, and these beliefs, there is no room. And so even though I had a strong faith from the outside and was so thoroughly involved in the movement, once I disagreed on one point, the entire thing toppled for me, because you have to believe every single point. And that's a sales pitch that Catholics love talking about, is like, you don't have to worry about biblical interpretation or this or that interpretation. We have the ultimate interpretation. We have Jesus's authority. But the downside of that is, once you disagree and you're like, no, I don't believe that, then everything else falls with it.
Yeah, that's one of my biggest struggles as well with the church, is that these are our beliefs, and this is sort of what it is, especially being gay and still being a Christian. I just wonder why some people move away from the church and why some people seem to stick with it. What are your thoughts on that?
I like to start every conversation on this topic with like, what does religion get you? Both somebody who's thoroughly in it and somebody who's partially in it. Is like, a lot of people, when you ask them like, oh, why are you religious? They'll give a bunch of arguments. And I like to sidestep and go like, no, what are the emotions? What are the feeling? Like, why is it that you choose to believe? Because at the end of the day, there's a lot of arguments out there. There's a lot of different things. And for the rest of our lives, we could be debating things. But at some point, we all make decisions about what we believe based off of the evidence. And so I'd like to, for people that are inside or outside of the church, is like, what does religion or lack thereof give you? And for a lot of people, they decide to stay Christian because they love the figure of Jesus. They love the mythos, this pantheon of ideas. They love the community at maybe they find an accepting church. And they love the fact that like they get to see all these people on a Sunday. When they're sick, they might have meals made for them. They get to feel like they're giving back to the community that Jesus is commanding them to heal the sick, to raise the dead, to help people, to feed the widow and the orphan, to take them in. And that's a beautiful thing. And so I think really at the end of the day, we all choose what we want to believe and what beliefs or what groups we want to belong to. And so why do people stay or leave religion? I think is like, what was religion for you and what did it get you? And is that something that kind of you wanted in your life?
Yeah, I suppose I would do away with the word religion. I think for me, I'm just like, well, Jesus gives me the ability to be more loving and more kind and more gracious. I would also like to say, yeah, this idea that we can choose our beliefs, I've been reckoning with that, because I don't think we can choose our beliefs. It seems to be causal, right? Like there are a certain amount of things that have happened to cause me to believe this certain thing. So it's almost like there are a certain amount of things that have happened to you to make you fall away, or sorry, I shouldn't use that word, fall away, but to not believe. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's all cause and effect.
Yeah. I like to say sometimes belief isn't the right word. I think that belief and belonging are kind of a Venn diagram that are almost entirely overlapped. That the media that we consume, the people that we talk to, the communities that we belong to, we seem to like pretty quickly as humans take on the beliefs and the identity of the people that we see and that we experience belonging with. And so I should say that we don't choose belief in that we have all of these sources and then we kind of sit in a room and they're like, which one do I want to take? But we do kind of choose what podcasts do we listen to? What movies do we watch? What books do we read? What sort of conversations do we have with friends? Who do we see on a daily basis? What sort of authorities do we belong to? And so I think both people that want to stay religious or become religious or leave religion, that I find if we kind of tweak the levers of of how we're belonging and what we're experiencing, our beliefs kind of naturally progress along with those levers. So almost kind of a secondary effect versus a primary causation.
You know, in the church, you had to suppress your identity as a gay man so much. How is that? How have you come to accept yourself as a gay man today?
So in Catholicism, the theology or the apologetics say that your experience is not your identity. And so a lot of Catholic apologetics relies on this. We never use the terms gay or queer or transgender or LGBT. Well, Catholics prefer the language of a person who experiences same-sex attraction or a person who experiences gender incongruity. And so a lot of Catholic thought and theology is like, how do we separate our identity as beloved children of the Father from our experience of being attracted to the same sex? And so you can do that for a period of time, and that I'm not my experience, I'm not my identity, my primary identity or my strongest identity is with the Lord. And then over time, and it's not laid out perfectly in documents, and so I think a lot of straight Catholics don't understand that over time, when you're in a community in which heterosexuality is the gold standard, that is what healthy people do, that's what holy people do, you kind of go, even though I'm not my experience, I'm not my identity, like this is a really big part of how I navigate the world, and I wish it wasn't the case. And I was just filming this morning doing an interview with a therapist who specializes in people who've come out of what is essentially, it's a smaller movement, but what is Catholic conversion therapy, which relies on this idea that same-sex attraction is really just a trauma response. And so by treating early childhood wounds and having good male role models, like we're not kind of this caricature of conversion therapy, which is hook somebody up to a car battery and do this aversion therapy. It's like we're just subtly saying that the reason that you're gay is because you have wounds in you, whether that's from parents or from early identity. And so you really, over time, after a few years of trying to do this, like I'm not my experience, I'm a man who experiences same-sex attraction, you start going like, but it is kind of core of how I go through life in terms of getting married one day in the church or becoming a priest, because priests aren't allowed to experience same-sex attraction. I was rejected from a monastery, even though I was completely celibate, in line with church teaching. Even experiencing same-sex attraction wasn't good. And so over time, I was like, we might not be our experiences, but this is an integral part of how I go through the world. This will dictate a lot of how I go through life. And if we have an experience that dictates so much of our life, how would we not call that an identity? That however we slice the pie, like I am a gay man, and that's something that isn't going to change. And I knew that after a few years, like this really isn't going to change no matter how many books I read or how healthy I try to be as a man. Like it's not going to happen. So it's like I'm sitting with this integral experience, one could even call that identity, and this standard of the church in which there is no room for reinterpretation, there is no room for change, there's no room for a compromise. I was like, I kind of got to pick one of these paths to commit to for the rest of my life. And I was like, and then I started feeling comfortable, like I am a gay man. That's something integral to going through life. And that informs so much of how I go through life. And so I started fading away in going, yeah, this kind of is an identity, no matter how you slice the pie. And I've personally found since leaving religion that being gay, being queer, or experiencing same-sex attraction, however we want to slice the pie, I think about it less. It's less integral of a part of my life because I'm just in a relationship. I'm just a guy. Like when there is no weight to either going to heaven or hell, you just live your life and you can move on with all these gay debates. And yeah, since then I've just kind of been living my best life.
That sounds really alleviating. I mean, because people always say to us, why do you have to make being gay your identity? And it's like, well, you're making it my identity. I don't care. Mm-hmm. And that's probably the best way I say to accept yourself these days is just to like get on with it, you know? Okay, so what do you, I'm interested because you said Catholicism, it gave you such a sense of meaning and purpose. What was it like shifting away? I mean, I almost want to ask what gives your life meaning and purpose today? It just must have been such a big shift for you.
Yeah, so leaving was probably like the lowest point that I've ever been in life, because I knew that I wanted to leave. But when you're seeped in this culture, when all of your subconscious beliefs are in a certain direction, when your only experience of love and community is in this group, and your identity and your livelihood and your friend groups and your sense of meaning are all lined up in this kind of like cloud of beliefs that you don't have access to, you can't change. And as soon as you leave all of it behind. And those first few months after leaving are really hard because it's like, I got to rebuild my life entirely, basically from scratch. Everything that I've worked for the past few years, all this community that I've built, it's gone. It's vaporized. These beliefs, and I think beliefs are, and these axioms or these heuristics that we have in our head are something that they take a long time to leave. When it's like, oh, I chose to leave Catholicism because I didn't want to be Catholic anymore. It's something that like a Catholic couldn't fathom because what you believe and what you think, like it doesn't matter. Everything's about heaven and hell and the church has the ultimate truth. And there's all these axioms that you live your life by that are still ingrained after you stop attending. And so those first few months were really hard of rebuilding everything from scratch. But what I did was find great community. I got involved in the ultra marathon community, which are people running 100, 200, 300 mile races in one go. I found a great sense of community there. And kind of, there's a scene in Indiana Jones where he's trying to steal this gold idol and he has this bag of sand and he's trying to like kind of take one for the other so that the scale registers the same weight. In a sort of sense, I was intentionally doing that because like I know that I still have to have community. I still have to have a sense of self-actualization. I still have to have this hope for tomorrow, and kind of found that in the running community. Because when you're out there running for 100 miles for 30, 40 hours at a time, it's a deeply profound, one might even say spiritual experience. And so I was intentional at kind of like porting over beliefs and community into this new group. But it takes time to really reset your brain when religion and especially these figures and these threats take up space in your mind. So it took a long time to really feel free of that sense of shame, that sense of guilt, that sense of the church says that I'm wrong, that sense of fear of hell. And now 2 years later, I kind of feel like it really took, I was in the movement for 4 or 5 years, and it really took a good year, 2 years to feel like I finally left, to not have that be waking up and like, am I doing everything wrong? Or am I going to regret this when I go to hell and I'm going to be burned for all of eternity? And so now when it comes to a sense of meaning, I consider myself a nihilist, which isn't a pessimist. A lot of people think nihilism is a sense of dread, a sense of I have no hope. But I like to say when nothing matters, what you care about does. And in religion, we're told what matters. We're told that these things have value, that these actions have value. And with nihilism, it's like nothing is imbued with meaning before we arrive to the scene, that there's things out there. And then we get to decide, and I think this is the message hope, is that we get to decide what we care about. I care about my family. I care about my boyfriend. I care about my business. I care about making the world a better place. I care about helping people who are still stuck in this religion. I have so much to care about, even though nothing matters. And so I say, when it comes to a sense of meaning, I don't like those debates because it's so much like this book says that and this philosopher says that. It's like, what do you care about? Like, what world do you want to live in? And I think so much of these shoulds out there, I don't like using the word should. I like to say, I want to live in a world in which people can grow up in accepting families and not go through religious trauma. Not it's wrong or people shouldn't be raised in religion, because that's kind of this external thing out there. I say, I want to live in a world in which that's not the case. I want to live in a world in which we can get rid of poverty. I want to live in a world in which we protect our environment. I want to live in a world in which I care about my family and my friends. So I'd say it's shifting from kind of like capital M meaning to what do I care about?
Yeah, and making your own meaning in life. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. So, because one of the associations or the definitions of nihilism is that life is meaningless, but you're saying find your own meaning.
Nothing capital M matters. Like things mean things to me.
Right.
But I say like things don't capital M matters, which is God or a creator or the Bible says that you have to do these things or you should live life this way. Or there's this like meaning out there that we're all searching for. I think regardless of what religion we belong to, we're all picking the things that matter to us. Because there's so many different branches of Christianity. There's so many schools of thought in there that like a certain sense, we're all making the meaning that we want to in the world. Some of us might say it's from a creator. Some of us might say it's not from a creator. But at the end of the day, we're all kind of figuring out what it is that matters to us, and then kind of like figuring out the philosophy from there.
Yeah, right. And how are you hoping sort of sharing your story of religious trauma and sort of being okay with your identity as a gay man now? Yeah, how are you hoping that'll help, or what are you hoping that will achieve, sharing your story?
The Catholic Church is big on what they call the intellectual tradition, or a particular strain of philosophy called Thomism based off of Thomas Aquinas. And Catholics have a lot of arguments. They have a lot of word games. They have a lot of different definitions. They have a very precise way about thinking about the world that nobody else in the world can really interface with, because words don't mean what you think they mean. What we care about or what we value in a conversation doesn't matter, and our definitions are very different. And so when I was in the Catholic movement, I think one of the reasons I was radicalized so easily is that once you accept the Catholic worldview and how Catholics think about the world, the only people that know that worldview and actually can work with your beliefs are people who are already part of the belief and are more radical than you. And also, Catholics have a lot of money. I've always worked in video production. I did a lot of work in Catholic media. The Catholic media sphere has so much money behind it, trying to convince people to join it. And I found that there's a lot of ex-Mormon content. There's a lot of ex-evangelical movement or content. There's a lot of like leaving big religions out there. But in the Catholic movement, I've seen some of these content creators try to interface with Catholicism, and it doesn't work because you have to know how the Catholic worldview works to effectively argue. And so I found once I left, and it's been 2 years since I left, and I'm starting to make content. Like, I took a long time to rebuild, to think through life, to kind of figure out what I wanted. And then I was like, there's a lot of people that I know who are still stuck in these mind games and these arguments and these axioms and these heuristics and this metaphorical substrate. And I want to show them, how can we deconstruct? How can we actually analyze these beliefs? How can we figure out if these beliefs are actually helping our lives? And really, there's a handful of people out there who had the experience that I did and have the tools to create. So I was like, I'm one of the few voices, as cocky as it sounds, that can like really make a dent, because I knew this theology so well and did so many debates on this topic. And so my hope is that people can negotiate faith on their own terms instead of feeling forced into a particular set of beliefs. And like I said, if your God has no problem with me, I got no problem with your God. And so I know a lot of people that still consider themselves Catholic or still Christian, or like me, have left altogether. And people are on different paths. And since leaving religion, I think I can recognize that different things work for different people, and people can be on different paths. But I don't have this dogmatic view of the world. I'm not set on every single person leaving religion. I want people to have a way in which they can analyze their Catholic faith to figure out, is that something that they actually want to believe and is making their life better? And if not, they can kind of renegotiate those beliefs in an intellectual way.
Yeah, right. What makes someone susceptible to being radicalized in religion, in your view? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think any high demand religion or cult, which is kind of a big word to throw out there, the commonality is people that have, one, a sense of loneliness. They're not super well integrated into an existing community. And two, they kind of have the low self-esteem, or they're struggling with something, or there's a big problem. They just don't feel adequate. And so kind of those two factors, whether it's a particular religion or religion in general, or a multi-level marketing scheme, or getting involved in politics super heavily, that when you can externalize and outsource solving of your problems to somebody else, then you're going to start kind of really gobbling up the beliefs that they have. And especially if you don't have an existing community that you're a part of that's willing to push back on some of these beliefs, you kind of have this sense of like, oh, maybe I kind of got to renegotiate things. If you are a blank slate, like cults every day of the week are looking for blank slates. You don't like yourself and you don't like your community. And then from there, once you're kind of, your foot's in the door, then they can rewire your brain from there with how they think about the world. And so when it comes to having a community, having a sense of self-esteem, like if you can have those two things, people are way less susceptible for believing crazy things that are out there.
Yeah, that sounds about right. What do you, sort of moving away from the church now, I think I asked you in an email, you said you were radically queer. What does that mean?
I think the past few years, we've seen a shift online with the internet, that I think the internet as a whole, or online discourse, if we call it that, is moving a little bit more step-by-step right-wing, especially here in America, and especially anytime conversations involving religion are starting to move a little bit more on the radical side. And I think been this movement within the queer community that's adamant to say, like, we want to separate kind of the LGB and the TQI plus. I'm gay, but I'm like one of the good ones out there. There's this let's push back on maybe some of these more radical queer beliefs. Let's make friends with the right-wing movement. Let's say we're not like the rest of the crazy community, especially in online discourse when we have this like all or nothing graph where it's either you're this caricature of the craziest LGBT advocates who are melting down in Starbucks because they got microaggressed and have purple hair, or we're this strong masculine civilization where we're saving America and we're part of Trump, we're going to have the best economy ever. And things tend to be pushing this way. And people's beliefs of the other side are only at the same level of radicalization. And so I think what's happening out there's a lot of voices in the gay community, in the queer community, where I want to say, like, we're not like the radical people. We're actually like really kind of cool on this right wing. And so when it comes to being radically queer, I don't think we can bifurcate the queer community. And I like the language of queer versus kind of LGBT. One, because people leaving religion might not have a set identity. That kind of gender identity and sexuality and how people label, those are just labels. And so I like to using kind of the omnibus word of queer, which is somebody who might not be entirely straight and not entirely comfortable in their own gender. And you can experiment with whatever identity you want from there. But in the queer community, we're all one in that, like, the right wing is never going to give us gay marriage and be okay with it. When there's a vote, especially in the American context, that the conservative movement overall, it does not matter how much you make friends with them, how much you say we're not like the other side, they're not voting for your rights. They're not voting for kids who are trapped in these families. They're not voting to protect you or your interests, no matter how much you separate from the transgender folks of our community. And so when I say radically queer, I mean that one, we're all one as a community, and that we have to recognize that the other side aren't going to give us rights. And two, this language of like, we're not like the other people, we're not crazy radical. I find it to be useless in fighting for our own rights because there's still so much progress that needs to be done. And that's only going to happen as one community, and recognize the only people we can really rely on are people within our same community.
Do you think there are some unhelpful ideas in the LGBT QIA plus or queer community? I mean, you know, from my own perspective, there did seem to be some ideas that seem to be pushing too far. And that's why all these organizations like Gays for Trump, Gays Against Groomers, LGBT Alliance sort of popped up. I don't know if I necessarily agree with the message that those organizations are promoting, but there does seem to be a bit of infighting. Do you see any problem with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the queer community is made up of a lot of different people and have a lot of different beliefs. In that there will always be crazy people out there. There will always be mean people out there. There will always be people that say crazy things that you're like, I don't know if we're ready for that. And I think so much of online discourse is like, let's start cherry picking those people from TikTok. Like if you look at the Ben Shapiros, the Michael Knowles, the Matt Walshes of the world, there's an entire cottage industry out there of pulling the craziest TikToks from there and just reacting and making this caricature out there. And so, yes, when it comes to like the data points that we're looking at, they can be diverse, they can be contradictory, they can be extreme out there. The thing that we have to go is like, so what are we going to do about that? Right? Are we going to abandon ship and say, oh, let's go for let's go for Matt Walsh, let's go for the Ben Shapiros, let's go for Trump? And the answer is like, no matter how nice you are to them, they're not giving you your rights. So when we look at what do we actually want to do about it, because we can complain on the internet, we can make cringe compilations, we can do a lot of things out there. When it comes to like, one, are these ideas actually going to help us? It's like, we could either go with a movement and say we're cool and hip and not like the other people and throw away our rights, or we can go, let's talk about these ideas. Let's figure out, is this something that we want to push? Is this something that's helpful? Is this something that we want to do? And if it's a crazy idea, awesome, let's have a conversation and not have those ideas. But let's have it in a discussion with a group that at the end of the day is going to actually vote for our same rights, to be able to get married, to be able to live lives free of discrimination, to be able to access healthcare. Like, let's have a discussion within that group. Because at the end of the day, like, people are willing to have discussions and not throw away that entire group and throw away our rights in the process.
I agree with you. I think we should be able to have discussions, but I just didn't see that enough in the queer community. I mean, it's even difficult to call us a community because you're right. We're a category of people with a multitude of different beliefs and backgrounds. Yeah, I saw an inability to talk about any of this. If you're a woman and you think your rights are being threatened by transgender women and you want to talk about it, it seems like you would just discredit it as a turf. If you want to have a conversation about young people transitioning, you're automatically a transphobe. But I would argue they're probably on the extreme side too. There are people that do want to have these discussions. I suppose it seems like people are now afraid to talk about it because they don't want to be deplatformed or ostracized or alienated from the, LGBT category. How would you like to see people how would you like to see people within the LGBT category having these discussions instead of having to band with the right?
Yeah, I would say that we should care about issues in proportion to the effect that they have actually in the outside world. And so when people want to have discussions about, especially in American discourse, there is so much talk around kids who are transgender. And it's like, we're talking about a handful of a few thousand of people out of 330 million people. Like, it's just not an issue that I care to particularly discuss with the right wing, because we got so much more problems here as a country of 330 million people than like a few thousand people out there. There's a great clip of Matt Walsh, who's a big American conservative commentator on the Joe Rogan Experience, talking about how maybe it's up to like millions of kids who have transitioned. And like, we're talking about a handful of a few thousand people. And I think that is a great conversation to have with those medical professionals, with those family, with people who are living through that experience. And we're talking about a few thousand people. So maybe 0.5% of our discourse as America can be spent on that. We got way bigger fish to fry. And so I find that a lot of these conversations are entirely useless to have because they're with people who don't care. They're with people who nothing's going to change their mind. They're with people who this doesn't affect in the slightest. And we're working ourselves up in a frenzy over, like, what do we want to do with this niche particular circumstance? And it's like, we barely got the Respect for Marriage Act passed in the Senate. Like, there are much bigger fish to fry. So let's talk about the big conversations. Let's talk about those in a public facing way. And the small niche issues that are a fraction of a percent of the population, let's have that be a fraction of a percent of our actual conversation. Because apart from that, it's just kind of talking on the internet endlessly about things that don't actually matter.
Yeah, it seems to be really blown out of proportion. And you're right, it is only a small issue. But it seems to be one that it's all over the media. Like, it's almost all anyone wants to talk about these days. Myself included, I guess. Maybe I'm guilty too, I
mean, it's sensational. It's a perfect thing that straight people have an emotional reaction to. Like, for a long time, especially in politics, people do a lot of workshopping. They do a lot of focus groups. They do a lot of like, what's the messaging that works? And I think through the mid to late 2010s, this idea of love is love, this idea of like, we just want people to be able to get married was something that worked well. And nobody was really kind of concerned about these small niche issues. And then conservatives started figuring out, like, what if we can manufacture an issue out of nothing? Like, when it comes to transgender athletes, when it talks to transgender kids, we're talking about very narrow cases in very unique circumstances with a fraction of a percent of people of the population. And they're like, so what if we made this the entire discourse? And they realize that, like, it works. It gets people emotional. It's like this visceral reaction that people have to conversations like this. And instead of talking about real issues that affect real people, it's like, let's distract, let's debate, let's make the most sensational headlines out there. And so I think it works for them, and they love talking about it. Instead of, let's talk about how can we reform healthcare? How can we talk about marriage rights? How can we talk about discrimination in the workplace? How can we talk about public transportation? Let's talk about tax policy. So much of conservative media is devoted to these niche issues that they have no skin in the game at all, but love talking about it. So when it comes to the issues, I have my thoughts on them, but I don't find them useful to talk about unless we're talking with policy experts in a very, very niche context.
Within LGBT activism, what do you think are the issues today that are worth talking about?
From a legal perspective or from kind of a social perspective?
Just from a social perspective, because I am just thinking, like, where we were at 20 years ago, we've definitely come a long way. And I'm thinking, like, do we need LGBT activism today?
The answer is absolutely yes. We still need the activism, because what we've seen, it seems like the queer movement's kind of taking its foot off of the gas, that, like, we have gay marriage, it's kind of solidified. And now we're seeing, like, oh, maybe it wasn't solidified as we once thought. And I think especially when we look at internet and especially political discourse, that these things like, oh, we have gay marriage and like conservatives, they're okay with it. And like we might disagree on some things. We're like, oh, shit, as the internet's being radicalized, like that's up for grabs now. So I think one is absolutely enshrining gay marriage, especially in American context. Like the Supreme Court has already overturned Roe, that the chances of, with a few more appointees, the idea of Obergefell being overturned is not crazy. And then the idea of not every state respecting that is also something there that is also not out of the possibility when we look at especially American politicians. So one is like enshrining gay marriage, the legal protections, the legal institution of marriage, absolutely is something that we need to talk about. From a social perspective, I think once again, and this is all kind of from my perspective in America, having talked to both sides of the aisle, is that there's a lot of discussion around masculinity, around strength, around gender identity. And so much of, I think, especially in religion, is that there's this idea of what it means to be a man. And to be a man means to be able to be strong, means to be capable of hurting other people, but we dial it back. That there's always this sort of violence, and that masculinity comes with a particular set of dressing, a particular set of sounding, a particular set of acting, a particular set of attributes and aesthetic. And I think now there is less like if you come out publicly, you're going to be beaten in the back alley, which still happens in this country. But there's this, you'll never be a man, which means you'll never be a good Christian, which means you'll never be a good business leader, which means you'll never be a good father, which means you'll never be okay unless you meet this traditional view of masculinity. And that if you're not masculine in a certain context, and I say this as somebody who presents quite masculine, that you will never be enough and you will always be shamed or not part of male circles, because masculinity is integral to people's identity. And dare I use the term like toxic masculinity, I think especially in American and within my generation, like 5 years older, they kind of have that gender debate. In my generation and younger, especially in online discourse, there is this huge idea of masculinity is our gold standard for how we need to present and says so much about you as a person. So I think from a social perspective, being okay with people are complex. People have a lot of different strengths. They have a lot of different weaknesses. They have a lot of different values, and how somebody presents does not dictate who they are as a person. I think is a conversation that my generation and younger needs to be having.
How would you like to see young people that have grown up in sort of a religious environment come to accept themselves today as gay?
So this will kind of go back to our discussion on nothing capital N matters. So what we care about does. And what that means when I was wrestling with coming out, with accepting myself, there's so many shoulds and shouldn'ts and do and don'ts, and you feel like you have to justify yourself to come out. And I think a lot of coming out discourse, people are like, I've always felt this way and I'll never feel differently. And like, I've gone through the ringer. The answer is like, if you want to come out as gay, like it doesn't matter if you have the reason, because you don't have to have a reason to come out. You don't have to have a reason to accept yourself. You don't have to have this long and tragic backstory, which most people have. You don't have to have the perfect intellectual reason why this is the case. You don't have to have any reason to come out other than you feel a certain way, you experience a certain thing, and you want to accept that to yourself. I think apologetics along the lines of when you're talking traditional Catholics, like I've always felt this way and it'll never change, can be effective when you're talking to other people, but for yourself, who knows? Yeah, maybe 10 years down the line, you'll wake up and not be gay. And that doesn't mean you're not gay now or you shouldn't come out publicly now. And I always hope like one day I'd wake up gay and like it never happened. So I'm at the point where like I know it's not going to happen. But even if you're like, fingers crossed, like maybe when I grow up, I'll grow out of it. It's like, no, like your friends are there to support you. Your parents are there to support you, hopefully, obviously, if you're in a safe environment. And so, hey, this is something that I'm experiencing now. I think I'm gay. Awesome. We should be able to have those conversations that are out there. And same thing why I like the label of queer versus gay is like, queer, like you can experiment with the labels. Am I gay? Am I bi? And I've talked to a lot of people who've reached out. They're like, I don't know what label I have. And the answer is like, you don't have to have a label. Like you should be able to talk to your family and friends and community about what you're going through. Like that's what friends are there for. And so when it comes to accepting yourself, you have to go like, there's nothing wrong with experiencing these attractions. There's nothing wrong with picking a label. There's nothing wrong. You don't have to justify yourself. You don't have to prove yourself. You don't have to debate other people. You can just accept yourself without all this baggage there, and your life's going to be so much better. And I was just talking to the therapist right before this, and like, even if you think you don't have the perfect label, you're not comfortable, maybe things will change in the future. It's like, have those conversations, because it's something that you're thinking about. It's something that's taking space up in your brain. And if you have supportive parents or friends, it's like, talk to them about it. Like, you might not have everything figured out. You don't have to have everything figured out before you accept yourself or before you start other people. You're on a journey. You're living life. You're growing up. You're experiencing things. And if it's part of your experience, like, it's part of your experience.
Thanks, Cade. I think that's a really good place to end. Where can people find you?
Yeah, just on my YouTube channel of Gay X Trad, across on YouTube, TikTok. I'm active on Instagram stories, but don't post a ton there. I also run the Intrinsically Ordered podcast, which is a play on words. The Catholic Catechism, which is like the book of beliefs, says that homosexual or same-sex attraction is intrinsically disordered. And so I was like, let's have conversations around intrinsically ordered. And so I'm talking with people who are still thoroughly Christian, still thoroughly Catholic, people like me who've left entirely. And so that podcast on all major platforms, also on YouTube and social media, is more of my like talking with people who might have different beliefs. And my main YouTube channel is kind of really opining and throwing my wonderful, amazing, half-baked opinions out there on the internet for people to take relief.
Love it. All right, man. All right. Well, it's been really good to chat. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you.